Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
Well, here we are again. And this week, David suggested the topic. And I think it's an excellent topic because it kind of ties in a little bit to some of other things we said before, but in a more indirect way. However, I do think it's a very important topic that is very relevant to our current situation, even if we're not going to talk about it from the perspective so much of the current environment in which we the current environment in which we inhabit. It's still, I think, timeless in its nuance, but more so now than maybe at other periods of time. And to avoid being vague any further, David, what are we talking about today?
Let's talk about partisan politics. In particular, if there are any merits of partisanship, and then the reason for which I raised this topic in the first place, the drawbacks and drains on society that are caused by partisanship.
Okay. So there isn't a definition for partisan politics. And the reason for that is partisan is an adjective, and then politics being the noun. So I think most people in the common parlance understand what politics are.
It is.
Fair enough.
But also, I will also disagree with that claim.
Okay.
I don't think that most people actually understand what politics is.
Okay. Well, let's start with the first word. Well, okay, actually, no. Let's talk about
The noun.
the noun first, because it is modified by the adjective. So let me pull up the Oxford while you give a more common parlance definition.
Well, politics is really it has lots of definitions, really. It always has to do with the way that society is organized. But politics might be the actual structure of the government, or it might be political principles, like guiding principles by which we should create a society, etc., etc.
Okay. The definition of politics from the Oxford, to give the formal, and to your credit, there are 2 primary definitions, but of the first primary definition, there are 4 sub-definitions, so it does really depend. The first definition of politics is the activities associated with the governance of a country or area, especially the debate between parties having power. The first sub-definition, which kind of sheds a little bit more light on what it's talking about, is 1.1 is the activities of governments concerning the political relations between states, and in this case, they're talking about authoritarian or sovereign nations. They're not necessarily talking about what in the United States we would refer to as a state. The second sub-definition is the academic study of government and the state. The third sub-definition is a particular set of political beliefs or principles. So that's one's politic,
Yep.
And then the fourth definition, often the politics of, is the usage. The principles relating to or inherent in a sphere or activity, especially when concerned with power and status. The example in this case given is the politics of gender. The second definition is activities aimed at improving someone's status or increasing power within an organization, which I think is the more common term. Like for you saying, oh, how was work today? Oh, I had to deal with a lot of political stuff. And they're not talking about government politics. They're talking about dealing between you and a different level of power, like a management, and then your management's a supervisor, things and so on and so forth.
And normally, just like so this is a sub-definition of the sub-definition of the first definition, which was when it said especially the debates between political parties, which I think is when most people think of politics, they think of political debating. They don't think of like the system as a whole, or guiding principles. And so likewise, this other definition of politics is normally meant in the negative, just being another word for office drama, basically, or just disputes between higher ups at a company.
Right. Now, that's politics. Now, the definition of partisan is where I think we're going to take more of the issue, perhaps. The definition of a partisan, when it's used in the, let's see, there's two versions. There's the noun, referring to someone as a partisan, and then someone or some, well, actually, no, there are two definitions of the noun. I'm going to say the first one because it's totally irrelevant, but it's funny. It's a weapon of the 16th and 17th centuries with a long shaft and a broad blade. So that's not quite, I mean, that makes for a really good double entendre on what partisan politics means.
I was going to say some analogies can be drawn here.
Exactly. More commonly in the 20th and 21st century, I'm going to skip directly to adjectives because that's the one we're talking about when we're talking about partisan politics most of the time. The first adjective is feeling, showing, or deriving from strong and sometimes blind adherence to a particular party, faction, cause, or person, exhibiting, characterized by, or resulting from partisanship. So being a member of a group, because I am a member of this group or I follow this ideology or person, I will strongly defend it, so on and so forth. The second definition is of, carried on by, or being military partisans. So there's also maybe usage of the word there where a partisan is a person who is essentially a warrior of an ideal. It doesn't have to be an ideology, but a partisan in just the adjective word is essentially saying a person who is a combative member of a group. When you say he is a partisan of the Warhammer Guild, that means he will fight people. And lastly, the noun form of the word partisan, or a partisan as a person or a partisan as a belief. A firm adherent to a party, faction, cause, or person. And the second definition is a member of a body of detached light troops making forces and harassing an enemy. Very interesting seeing some of the origins of these words. So that's where we're going to leave it. Definitions. Do you think that's pretty clear?
Yes.
Okay. So David, we did not assert. We've not asserted a position thus far. So let's examine this from an objective as much as we can standpoint. What are, at its face value, in your mind, some of the benefits to a system of partisan politics? Because the fact that partisan politics exist is nothing. Something's existence cannot make it moral or immoral necessarily, but when put into action.
Well, I'm going to make an assertion right off the bat, which will inform both the benefits and the drawbacks of partisanship, which is partisanship is just tribalism.
Well, okay. Define tribalism.
Well, okay.
And then you can't say partisan politics, because otherwise...
Yes, I can. So, tribalism, just like partisanship, is strict adherence to a group, particularly an in-group, as distinct from the out-group, the other, normally irrationally. You are allied to this group without a real clear reason other than you are just allied to it.
Well, the formal definition in its root form doesn't agree, because tribalism is just the state or fact of being organized into a tribe or tribes. However, there is the derogatory form of the word, which is the behavior or attitudes that stem from a strong loyalty to one's own tribe or social group. So I could see in the derogatory form, yes, it's the same thing.
Well, even with the first definition, if we then further examine what it means to be part of a tribe, then it sort of just follows that that's the kind of behavior that it leads to.
Well, I guess that would depend. For example, based on the discussions we've had before, we are of the opinion that tribes are self-selected. By that meaning you get to select what tribe you're in.
I don't necessarily agree with that.
Okay. I mean, there's the obvious example. there are factors that we cannot control that put us into air quote tribes.
Well, I'm even thinking historically, the things that would normally historically land you in a tribe is just you were born into the tribe.
Right. However, that does not dictate or demand that you have a blind loyalty to it.
Correct, but our psychology creates this.
Okay. Do you saying our psychology creates this by default, or it creates it most of the time?
It is the most authority with which I can speak on this is to say that it is a psychological tendency to do this, and that's why we see things like tribal grudges throughout history, where so and so from the whatever tribe hurt somebody a long time ago in our tribe, and so we hate them.
Well, okay. I'm going to bring up an instance we've stated before when we talked a little bit about beliefs, because beliefs are typically tribalistic, can be tribalistic. The Jains. You're familiar with the
Yes.
Religion of Jainism.
Mm-hmm.
It is a religion, right?
Yes.
It's not just a philosophy, it's a religion. Well, within that, if there were a tribe of people that their primary identifying factor was that they were all Jains, and don't get me wrong, there are probably societies where that is the case with every member of the society. You were born and raised in a Jain environment. The ideology of the environment, does that affect the positive, neutral, or negative nature of their tribalism in this case? Because, for example, I would have a hard time, because if the ideology of the group is a passive one, that is...
Yeah, I see where you're going. Okay, well, tribalism does not necessarily... And this negative form of tribalism doesn't necessarily imply violence, merely strong loyalty.
Right. So,
strong loyalty without good reasons, normally.
Okay. So we're not talking about the actions encouraged by the tribe or the things...
It's more about the attitude than the action.
Okay, so for example, you can do a good thing, but if you're doing it for tribal reasons, that is bad. Or that's what you're calling into question. The motivations for what you do. Tribalism as a motivation.
Right.
Okay, so...
You're doing good things for bad reasons.
Sure. And so that's an important distinction to make, because I do feel like, because I would tend to agree with you that we all exhibit tribal tendencies, because that's what allowed human beings in a large way, anthropologically speaking, in a very high overview, don't be wrong. I don't have the authority to speak anthropologically. I'm not an expert. But from what I've read about it, and from what is fairly obvious, and to avoid the whole it's common sense fallacy, that is what seems to happen most. And if we observe it in history, one of the benefits of tribalism is it provides you a way by which altruism can exist, which is one of the main reasons we have benefited genetically in our propagation. You know, we don't eat our young, we don't compete in the very tightest knits of groups. Typically we want to avoid those problems, and you can achieve that if you're all on the same page. So
right. And so I was going to state that as perhaps one of the benefits to partisanship, because just like a benefit of tribalism, cohesion, social cohesion, having a unified goal is a powerful thing that, for whatever cause you're trying to further, is a formidable strength to have. And if you're, of course everyone believes they're on the right side. So if you're trying to do the good thing, and you have this kind of power on your side, then it is a good thing.
Right. I think that is a good reason. I think tribalism, in the maybe anthropological sense, provides the framework for cooperation. However, in a scope that is not indicative of the types of societies we inhabit now. For example, the civilizations that exist today are many orders of magnitudes larger and more complex than even 1,000 years ago. And there was these natural, and I mean this both geographical buffer zones between tribes where when you don't often encounter people of a much different tribe than you. And I think if you were to able to measure like tribal beliefs somehow empirically, they gradually change over geography. Tribes that are located in one geographical region, like let's take the United States for example, Native Americans of similar regions would have some overlap. Now, granted, the standard deviation grows the farther away you get. All the way to the point where if you go to the entire opposite side of the world, you see very different culture. Okay. So, acknowledging one of the benefits, we've stated that tribalism as a human tendency is what has allowed us to move essentially from being almost into a different class of social animal, right?
Maybe. I'm not going to try to speak with authority on what other animals might exhibit tribalistic behavior.
Well, but okay, would you say that you would have to have at least animals would have to be at least in some form social to at least have tribalism?
Oh, yes. Tribalism is a purely social phenomenon.
Right. And so what I'm saying is, again, I don't have the authority either, but I think something that's easily observable is that social animals tend to do better competitively in an environment than non-social animals. And then of the social animals, the ones who exhibit the tribal tendency, because I wouldn't necessarily say that it's linked, like you would have to have some level of tribalism if you're social.
I think that
maybe you would, I don't know.
Yeah, I see where you're going for the latter here of social, I guess.
There's a layer cake essentially
right.
of.
Well, I think right. And so if we want to, I don't want to stay on the topic of tribalism for too long, but
fair enough.
But I think that perhaps a problem with tribalism is that it has gotten us very far. Obviously, these societies are built originally because of our tribalistic tendencies, but now we have created a world that is so interconnected that our tribalism actually pulls us apart and makes us weaker than if we didn't have it. So it's as if we have so societally outgrown our tribalism, but because it is so baked into our psychology, we can't drop it.
And I would agree that our psychology, I see what you're getting at, and our psychology takes a longer time to adapt than our social cultures.
Our environment,
Our
basically.
environment, yeah. I would agree to that, because our psychology has a lot to do. I'll say it's a lot to do. It has somewhat to do with our physiology as well. And just as it takes a long time for physiology to evolve over time, such does it for our psychology.
Right.
Okay.
And tribalism is so deeply baked in that it's not something that we can, reverse indoctrinate, in children. We can't teach children not to behave tribalistically. They do this on their own.
Right. So to move away from the word tribalism, because we're talking about partisan politics.
Right.
Partisan politics, would you agree, let's adopt a new working definition for now, is essentially tribalism being displayed in political systems.
Basically. But it's more than that, because the party is some, it's a different sort of entity.
Well,
it's just a tribe.
It's not just a tribe. It is by definition, it is a set of ideologies around which people.
Exactly, and the party represents more than one thing at the same time.
Right,
and that's what makes partisan politics especially messy. And that's sort of where I wanted to go with it. Is that I think for me the deepest problem with partisan politics is that it marries together ideas that don't necessarily have anything to do with one another, but basically in our political system, you cannot support one without dragging along others that you may not actually agree with.
Right. Like, just to use an example, you could have a political party that supports one stance on an issue like abortion we discussed before, but and then also support a stance when it comes to maybe economic policy. And what you'll get is people where their primary issue is the abortion topic, And people
this is the birth of the single issue voter, because
Right.
because it's so messy that someone just has to decide this is the most important thing for me and I'm going to vote this way regardless of the side effects.
Okay. And I think that... Okay, let's go ahead and do our due diligence. Is there any benefit to having a single issue voter?
Is there any benefit to having a single issue voter?
Because, I mean, we can say that like it's a bad thing, but I think we need to at least look and see if there's any good acknowledgments, to be fair.
Yes, I think there is a problem with the single issue voter. Let's take, for example, someone who is a single issue voter on firearms.
Okay.
They are in support of the civilian right to own firearms. Let's ignore the details and just say that that in this hypothetical election cycle, the opposition seeks to ban firearms outright, and so they are against this. Okay. Now, suppose the pro-firearm party also has, as part of its platform, as we see in the United States, lots of policies which, well, I don't want to get into specifics, but basically bringing along religious baggage.
Okay.
And so things that might actually abridge First Amendment rights, like freedom of speech, or might seek to establish religious control over school curricula or things like that. That are things
any violation of the Establishment Clause, essentially.
Right. So, but these single issue voters, and of which there are many when it comes to firearms, basically create a unit where every member of this group of single issue voters is going to vote for the party who is pro-gun, regardless of what the other policies are. And so this gives the party who is pro-gun the ammunition, no pun intended, that they need to bring in all this other garbage.
Well, it inflates the influence of, essentially, okay.
It allows them to smuggle in other things that may not actually be able to get in on their own merit because people are smarter than that. Well, okay, that's a different claim entirely. But
yeah,
regardless, things that may not be able to get in on their own because they don't stand on their own merits, but they get in because these single issue voters want to vote for the party that supports their single issue.
Right. And I think if you blow this out to its logical conclusion, what you end up with is an ability for minority opinions to ride on the coattails of popular opinions. And people are forced into these groups due to necessity. Because, for example, if you are, say, a person in the opposite political party, but you're still a single issue gun voter, you have to choose. You're forcing people to choose what their most important issue is, and then stick with the party that has their most important issue, or take the aggregate across all of their opinions and see which party happens to agree with, the majority of my opinions, and you end up with these awkward coalitions that otherwise shouldn't have to exist. And I want to go ahead and bring that out because in the United States, having a two-party system, it's exacerbated because now these two parties essentially there's very little they agree on, but that's almost because they have to. Because if they agree with the other party, then they could potentially lose blocks of single-issue voters to the other party, even if it's better for the voter. It creates a conflict of interest between political organizations and the citizen. If you look at other governments, like for example in Israel, that's just the first one that comes to mind, they have a coalition-style government where being a single, you essentially have each party is focused around a specific topic. Like there is a person and if you applied it in the United States, there would be a pro-gun party. And so what you do is if you are a single-issue voter on guns, you go to that party. Now, this doesn't all the way solve the problem because you don't get to pick how the political organization allies itself either once it gets into government. And I guess if looking at the problem in the abstract how do you take the aggregate of an opinion? How do you take the popular opinion on just a single issue when I think the ultimate problem is that this is a weak shortcoming of representative republics. In the long run, that's what it is. Because when you elect a person into office, they get to vote on every issue, not just the issue they were maybe elected to uphold. And so even in a coalition-style government, I'm kind of processing this as I go, you still could end up electing as a person on a single issue, but you still have to take some of the other issues, into account as well.
Yes.
Because you only get one vote.
Right. Well, and so that might be a problem with the coalition system as well.
But the thing they have in common is that they're representative democracies.
You're right. But suppose, okay, we're going to ignore the details of how this actually ends up working in practice, but imagine a no-party system and everyone runs as an individual. Now, at least, when I'm presented with my candidates, I can look them up individually and see what their positions are, and they're going to be a lot more variant than a party platform, which has to be very rigid and stay, quite consistent over time. Individuals can change, or even which individuals are on the ballot change over time, as opposed to the parties, which remain constant. Then I can pick and choose who I think is the best fit. And by the time next election cycle rolls around, my options may be vastly different.
Right. And I still think there are issues, even if you ignore the practical issues with having that type of political system, because the biggest obvious problem is, what is the minimum bar for election at that point? If you have 100 candidates that could represent your geographical area, which that's another problem, geographical tribalism, in addition to that, because we are voting not based on our opinions or our ideas, but we're really voting based on geographical locking. I happen to have to vote with all these people I'm nearby. Now, this is okay to a degree because of the same reason. People in the same area, at least traditionally, tended to have the same opinion, and so they could be gerrymandered. Gerrymandering actually started out as a good thing. For those who don't know, it's when you redraw districts for election purposes. That's in the short run what it is. It gets more complicated than that. It's a hotly debated issue now, but originally it was a good idea, because then you could get people who had a majority of the same opinions together, because they tended to be geographically clustered. In the modern world, that's not the case anymore. People move around all the time, and I may go to a different place where I am very different from most of the people there for a work reason, but now I am in a minority, as opposed to where I grew up would have been the majority, more likely anyway. But I think, going back to address your original issue of, say, I have 500 candidates to vote for in my geographical area of 2,000 people that they're going to be representing, right? I can find somebody that I like and say, but what is the bar? Does that person still have to get 50% of the population's vote, or is it just whoever has the most? Because if there's 500, a person could win and only actually be representing 5 people.
Right. Yeah, we can't do that. To avoiding this becoming an episode about voting systems, I would say that at first glance, a good voting system seems to be single transferable vote, as has been talked about by CGP Grey, our favorite.
I need to put this down to link.
Yes.
But yes, that's one way to get around it, but it doesn't entirely eliminate the problem. I think because in that type of voting system is agnostic to, it's still a representative voting system. And it is still a system in which you end up with one person getting to speak on behalf of a bunch of others.
Yes. But my biggest thing about there being more candidates and varying candidates is that from election cycle to election cycle, your options are not nearly as consistent as they are with parties, which I think is a good thing. Because with parties, you have party platforms, which are difficult or impossible to change. And so then we basically have the same exact 2 big picture sets of opinions against each other every single 2 years when we have an election in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But with individuals running, it individuals running with term limits, it can be very fresh every single election cycle.
Okay. Well, let me go to the logical other end of the extreme. Why not have a direct democracy? Where each person gets to vote on every issue. And remember, this is still within the realm of, let's ignore the practical issues of that. Practical issues aside of, it's really hard to coordinate every single person.
Okay, if we ignore the practical issues with direct democracy, as far as solving the problems of partisanship, I don't have a problem with it. I have other problems with direct democracy.
Right, but that's the thing, is it would absolutely solve, because there's no parties at that point.
Right.
There's no point, A party at that point is just, it just occurs on each issue, but the voting power of the party is directly related to the number of people on the side of the issue. So as far as
but a representative can also represent more than one issue. That's why I said, that's why I preferred that over, say, the coalition system, because then once you get the pro-gun party into power, okay, but what else do those people who make up that party think?
Right. Well, that's the thing. In a coalition system, to just elaborate just a bit, you have, I think, in a coalition system, what ends up happening is each party is voted on. There is no regional voting. Everyone votes as a single block. But what happens is there is a list of people on the list. There's a list of people, and it's the top, say, 100 people that get votes. And so if I'm a gun-only voter, I'm going to go vote for the guy who, these three guys support guns on the list, and they're all backed by the same party. And so what the party will do is put multiple candidates out that have a variety of opinions, of which they've already, and don't get me wrong, there could have been many, many more, but they mitigate out the ones they know that you're not going to want based on the culture. And so you'll have 3 pro-gun people where that's their primary thing. Now, don't get me wrong, they will each have a secondary opinion on, and 2 of them might be pro-nationalism and 1 is pro-globalism, for example. So if I am my first issue is gun and my second issue is nationalism, well, I'm going to drop the globalist and I have 2 people. And my third issue is like abortion. Well, one of them happens to be pro-abortion, the other happens to be pro-life, one happens to be pro-choice. Well, I'm going to pick the pro-choice guy. Boom. There's my guy. He represents me on my top 3 issues, and I just vote for him. And when it's all said and done, everybody who shares those same top 3 opinions, and it's not just limited to 3, if enough of us vote for him, he will get into office, and then he is in this mass of people that seem to have a greater correlation of representation on at least an ideological basis. Now, again, still problems with it, because you can't guarantee that the pro-gun party is also going to run somebody who meets the next 3 criteria, but they are motivated to, because in order to get their primary issue addressed, they need to have at least somewhat of a popular opinion on their second, third, and so on ideas or on their platform.
Yes.
But it at least breaks up these weird tribes. You get less weird tribes that way. Let's move. I think, back to the issue of partisan politics. Would we want to discuss, because we kind of talked about what the primary issues are, and that there are very little benefits, but if there were any benefits, where they originated and where they come from. But we still have about a half hour to talk about it. So, are there other issues beyond the fact that you get really incoherent tribes, and you also get, then there's the problem of single issue voters? Those are really the 2 things we've kind of listed so far.
So, yes, I have more problems.
More money, more problems. But go on.
So, this is the kind of thing that got me to raise the topic in the first place, where the tribalism aspect of partisanship gets to the point where people become unwilling to consider other opinions because of which party proposed the thing.
Okay. So it's almost like the negative effect. Instead of, well, obviously you said it's a bad thing, but I mean negative in the opposite effect, where instead of me, I think it's both. Like, first you'll find yourself end up supporting an argument that you maybe don't necessarily agree with, but just because your single issue is addressed, then you will just kind of, over time, accept the other
I'm not
ones.
even necessarily talking about single issue voters at this point.
I know that, but I'm using it in the same frame, but for example, it's, if my primary issue is pro-gun, well, the other party is anti-gun, and so they clearly don't know what they're talking about, and they have all bad ideas. And so the characterization of those on the opposite side of the political aisle is always bad,
Right. And so we have this notion of, and I've heard this from just people that I talk to, as well as political pundits, which is, whenever you find yourself agreeing with, name your party here, you should reconsider what you're thinking about, et cetera, et cetera. You have this sentiment of you are agreeing with the slimy other people, so what you're thinking is bad.
Well, and I think there's the real issue we've kind of stepped around, but I think needs to be addressed is, I think that might be rooted in a separate issue as well, but it's the issue of attaching your morality to your politics. For example, if I think that you are bad as a person for disagreeing, that is what really enables me, because that could happen on an individual level. I could think a person, and this happens all the time when, for example, religion gets entangled into politics, because religion typically deals mostly with morality, not always, but that's one of the biggest things that it usually offers its opinions on. I'm going to give a specific instance. Looking at the abortion issue in the United States, well, most of the people who support pro-life do it for a moral reason. Now, I'm not saying that's a good reason, but they say it's moral to be pro-life. Well, if it's moral to be pro-life, you're essentially also stating that it's immoral to be pro-choice. Now, at that point, you've already castigated your opponent as immoral. And so anyone in a party that supports abortion is immoral, because you apply and mirror the same partisan tendencies that you exhibit, and you are moral. You apply the opposite to that person. And so now there could be a pro-life Democrat, for example, in the United States, that just happens to agree with the Democratic platform on every other issue. That person's immoral. Even if they share the same belief as you, you still make it about morality, and they are a bad person. And once you've put a person in a morally good or bad box, it taints every other opinion you can have of them. And you can't, not to make a pun, but you can't agnostically make an opinion about just their ideas. You can't address the idea anymore. And it's not just abortion either, and it's not just the religious right that does this. There are plenty of issues that get thrown in or castigated in a moral light. And don't get me wrong, it's effective for maintaining the system of partisan politics, because you get the benefit of also telling everybody that is in the party, even if they disagree with their second, third, whatever tier issue, at least you're a good person. And we all
exactly. You insulate yourself from the possibility of somebody voting for the other party, because you have now instilled and fostered a culture in your party of, well, the other side is evil, so you shouldn't even consider supporting them.
Well, and the other party doesn't help most of the time, because once one party goes down the moral road, it's very hard for the other party to not go down that road as well.
That's right.
And so now the other party is keeping your people out. And even if the person isn't being kept in by you saying, like, a wall does two things. It keeps people out, but it also keeps people in, A fence in a prison serves two functions. It's not just to keep criminals in the prison. It's also to keep people from getting in, But it essentially puts up a wall in that case where, and it puts up a wall that both sides contribute to. They both build that wall, in this case. So even if this person would want to switch sides, it makes switching sides, which that is also a partisan politics framing, calling it to switch sides, and implies somewhat of a defection, which is usually seen as immoral. You end up with people being trapped in a location where they feel like they have nowhere else to go, and at least you can be seen as a good person here. And if anything else, the partisan politics game creates scenarios where people are trapped against their will in a place that they don't want to be. But if you're not going to be accepted by the other group, then the ultimate bad, because in game theory, these are when you look at partisan politics through the game theory lens, the these are your safety solutions. These are your safest bets, is to just pick a side. The worst can still happen. That's not the worst that could happen. The worst that could happen is you could be exiled from both. And now you are no longer a member of any group. At least until a majority of the people don't, until there are enough people who get exiled, and then the system crumbles apart and then it rebuilds. Now, keeping in that thread, there is not just the ultimate bad, but there's the ultimate good, and that is that we don't form those. You don't play that game. You don't create the system where the two safest bets are political parties, and then the worst bet is people getting extricated. That's my opinion.
Right.
But anyway. But no, yeah, I would agree that that's also a bone to be picked with the partisan politics system. So that's 3. So now to recap, we've got awkward coalitions, that other unnatural coalitions that normally shouldn't have to be formed. What was the second one again? How did you frame it?
The one we just did?
No, there was one before that. Other bad thing. Oh, poor representation of ideologies, because in this system you can't get adequate representation for an opinion. Either something gets overrepresented because its numbers are inflated by other people on different topics, or it gets underrepresented because you fracture the base. And then the third one being it creates essentially social sinkholes for both, and also creates the third zone of you're not accepted by either. And there isn't really a good alternative, because once you've entered the realm where the safest bet is one or the other, there isn't a way that you can be accepted by both. And so, but you can definitely be expelled by both. So those are the 3 primary issues so far. Any other bones to pick while we're going down the list?
None that come to mind immediately. Those are the things that I have most had a gripe with, particularly that last one more recently.
Right. I would tend to agree with you. I think there is another bad that it affects a lot less people, because it only affects those who are agents in the system that act on behalf of the parties. And I think this is another topic we've had listed for a while, but in this type of system, it creates an environment in which the representatives representing these groups of people cannot you're forced to make a choice between representing opinions you personally disagree with, or risk representing these people in a way that you think is right. Just to be clear, the other topic that we have on the list is the concept of the representative being elected to represent a group of people. Once that person's elected, are they elected to be themselves and vote how they think, or are they elected to vote what they know their constituents want? Because it's not guaranteed that the person you elect agrees with you on every issue, right? So in a robotic sense, this is what we're creating, is a person who will vote in a way that they disagree with and act against their will, act against what they would have done if unaffected, just because they know they won't get elected again if they don't, And so, because I would argue that it's very hard to find a person that agrees wholeheartedly with every topic of a party's platform, especially in the United States when you only have 2 parties to pick from. And you do see overlap, or you have in the past. So I think the reason in the past we've seen more overlap is because the partisan nature of politics wasn't as strong. And so what you could do is you could see overlap where there were some Republicans who actually, and if they were in a different state, would have been a Democrat. But because of the geographical differences, whatever key demographic issue is in that geographical area, that person is, like, for example, let's take the pro-gun issue. Well, if you're in a southern state that is very pro-gun, right, then you are elected for your pro-gun stance, and maybe not just due to the single issue voter, but because that is one of the most important issues across the board. But you're also in a state that loves guns, but also loves entitlement programs. Well, now you disagree with almost every other person in your political party over the entitlement program question. And you find yourself agreeing more with everyone else, And as you find there are other platform proposals that you happen to agree with people on the other side of the aisle, you can do that while also representing your base, right? the partisan nature of politics, I think, is also further exacerbated by nationalization of parties, where parties become more and more about the whole of the state and not about the regional differences. And that's, I think, one thing we're seeing in the United States is the United States has 3 levels, well, more than 3, but 3 primary levels we allocate government to. There's the local, which includes county, city, township, whatever. Then there's the state that they live in. So there's the actual, like the state of Texas, the state of New York, California.
Provincial, basically.
Provincial, yeah. And then there is the national. Well, when the focus is only on the national, which I think is becoming more and more of a problem, you will find there are people in areas that are forced into a group of people that they normally wouldn't agree with because they have very different geographic, like the regional cultures are very different, but they somehow line up in this almost on every issue. They group together. And then when you have that group, you don't have the benefit of the strata of varying opinion. And you see these echo chambers occur inside the political system at the national party level, where, because these people that are representatives, yes, they are from a specific place that they represent, but they are taken out of that place and put in an entirely new arena where they now have to get along with people that they don't represent, but they are linked to through essentially finances, because that's really all a political party does. Political parties exist to redistribute funds across regional areas and essentially represent a national platform in a system that was designed to represent local constituencies, right?
Right.
I think that could become its whole other episode.
I think it could.
Because, not to go down the road of history too much, but the whole point of having a representative democracy and the way it was constructed had a lot to do with representing each geographical smaller area. What was quickly realized is, fact of the matter is, certain areas are richer than others. There are also certain areas in which you don't have to worry about, when you make issues national, for example, you don't see very many Democrats coming out of Alabama, for example, because they have a very homogenous culture. Not totally, but very homogenous. And because of that, and this is back to the wall concept, a Democrat can't run in Alabama and then also maintain the similar ideologies to their local constituents, because they will be rejected at the national level. So the national party kind of locks itself out of that area, and so you only have Republicans to choose from. Now, they still campaign, they still raise money, but it doesn't cost hardly anything to win an election as a Republican there once you're picked by the party. Once you're picked by the party, you're good. Well, all that money you raised now can be funneled through a national system to what's called a purple district, where, now you're in a fierce competition. And so now you have these national entities funneling money from areas that they're safe into combat zones or contested zones, to rehash the partisan nature. Yeah, that's a whole other episode, man. That's a whole other thing. But it exists because of partisan politics, in a sense. And so I think if we do that episode, we would have to refer back to this episode for sure.
Sure.
Okay. I want to address one other characteristic of partisan politics, just to go ahead and feel like we've done a complete job. And that is and this kind of is where it overlaps more with tribalism, but not necessarily. And that is going back to what makes it partisan and what is commonly associated with the partisan part of partisan politics. And that is supporting or defending ideas you do not believe in, or supporting or defending ideas for just the reason that you are a member of a group that also defends those ideas. Any system that exists, I think, that is collective identity. And that's a mild form of collectivism. And it's supported by the system and it encourages, I would argue, poor behavior from its participants because...
Well, yes, because it encourages the participants not to think for themselves.
Exactly. And the party benefits from this because, don't think about that, Let's look the other way on this issue. Hey, you're the good guy, But it also is bad for the individual because I think that type of behavior isn't one that you can only apply in certain areas of your life. Because we each have, whether we acknowledge them or not, a set of principles or a set of values by which we live our lives. And it's unhealthy for human beings to hold dissonant opinions. Cognitive dissonance is a thing. I don't know if we did an episode on it yet or talked about it, but
no.
That's something else that would be interesting to look into. But a person who accepts a belief and just goes with it, if they do that about their politics, it's very easy to just start doing that about other things in your life. And I think that's why taking the rational perspective on things is contagious. I don't know about you, but personal anecdote time here in the last 10 minutes or so we've got. So screw it. Whenever I began essentially using a form of street epistemology on myself, which is where there's a name for it, Introspection, yes. When I began looking introspectively at what I believed and questioning it, that's a process that is very hard to stop once it's started. And it has to start with one issue. And for me, it was religion. But it didn't stop at religion, and it's a way of life in the way that once you start doing it, it'll spread to other beliefs that you have.
Right. Once you learn to think for yourself, you realize how many other things you haven't been thinking for yourself about.
Right. And I think if you frame that issue to anybody and say, don't you think that thinking for yourself is good? I would argue that most people would just agree with you. Like, yeah, that's a good thing. But it isn't until you begin advocating putting that into practice that you start to see problems. Because people don't like having their ideas challenged, even by themselves. It's comfortable to just believe this because it's just good, or it right. I don't have to think.
Well, right. Well, also there's just a problem of self-awareness, and this is not necessarily an accusation because, like you, I've gone through that sort of epiphany myself. So I'm not necessarily condemning people for this, but there is a lack of self-awareness about this. You don't realize that you're not thinking for yourself until you figure out how to think for yourself and realize, how much you've missed.
Right, and you're not going to try to figure out how to think for yourself until you think to think for yourself.
Right, well, because if you don't realize that your opinions have just been handed to you and you think that you're thinking for yourself even when you're not, then you feel like there's nothing to change.
Right. And in order to admit that you haven't been thinking for yourself is a hard admission because you kind of have to admit that you weren't, and
people don't want to admit that they were wrong.
Right.
Yeah, that's it.
And if you never have to call into question why you might be wrong, you never have to admit you're wrong, And I think that's also, that, like tribalism, is a part of human psychology as well. It's a bias.
I was going to say, it's almost like single-member tribalism, where you just, you agree with yourself so much that you refuse to accept that you could be wrong about something.
Singleism. Yeah. And so I think also in just discussing this, we've also figured out that, I say figured out, because we're geniuses over here at Philosophers. But I think that is one of the potential, or at least the start of where you can start looking for the answer. Because if you acknowledge that partisan politics is a thing and that it is a problem, which ironically, most people who participate in partisan politics kind of also agree that it's a problem, but they don't accept that it's their problem. It's always the other. It's funny, you can watch two parties that exercise partisan politics on a daily basis blame the other person for being partisan without realizing how hypocritical that is.
Right.
But the way we might be able to address the issue is not going to be, I think, in attacking the institutions that don't attack the institution directly for encouraging partisan politics. I think it's one of those things that we have to address on an individual level, And I think that's why the work of people like Anthony Magnabosco, for example, we've talked about him before, is so important, because that's what he does. He talks to individuals every single day. And even though his is focused primarily, not just on religion, but just a single belief that a person holds, that's all it takes, is to get a person to start thinking critically and having some self-examination about a single issue, and then it will spread to other issues most of the time. And I think that's why that activity is so important. I'm actually going to go ahead and write down to link that one as well, just his whole channel, I guess, because he does really good work. It's very interesting.
Yes, he's picked it back up again recently. He's started to spread out into other issues as well, which is interesting.
Yeah, but that's the whole point, is once you can't, I feel like, treat one issue one way and another issue the other way. The way by which you process, the mechanism by which you process your ideas, you can't have more than one mechanism to process ideas. That's something that is kind of hardwired into us, to only do it one way and then take everything and push it through that same system. And that's hard, because you are rationally having to overcome a psychological tendency that is hardwired into you as a human being. And some will say, well, I mean, that's just how we are. Like that's an excuse. That's another thing I think we need to address maybe in the future is,
the status quo.
The status quo in general. Why, and essentially that's just calling into question the fallacy of tradition, or even nature. Like, well, humans be like this, so that's how humans be. Why?
Well, just because they are like this doesn't mean they have to be like this.
Exactly, and that's essentially status quo, like you said.
Right.
So yeah. So I guess, let's since we're wrapping up, let's put it all back in a nice little bow tie that I can split off into a preview later, if I choose to do that. Because my voice is also starting to leave me a little bit too. And so I'm talking more quietly. So, partisan politics. We outlined 4 primary issues. Well, 3 primary and 1 perhaps secondary issue with partisan politics. The first problem with partisan politics was, do you remember, David? Or do we need to end this episode here and then me go back and tack it on later?
No. The first issue was weird coalitions.
Yes.
Ideas being associated with one another that are completely disparate.
Yes. The second,
we already had to remember this one once.
I know, right? It's almost like it's important. Well, we called it single issue voting.
Yeah.
It was around that, but essentially it was a lack of representation. Lack of adequate representation in a political system, either on inflation or deflating numbers. In a nutshell, it's inaccurate, or causes inaccuracies. The third
was demonization of the other side.
Mm-hmm. Or at the very least, maybe it's encouraging, it's dragging and encouraging a moral stance when it comes to ideas that aren't inherently moral or immoral.
Right.
And then the fourth secondary, which isn't a really super primary issue because it only affects those who are involved in the system, is that it forces people into scenarios. Well, it creates a system in which people who can give up their individualism rise to the top. People who, the people who think the least for themselves will rise to the top and be advantageous in the system, essentially. People who will just adopt whatever opinion the party has without thinking it through critically makes its way to the top. And they are people put in positions of political power. And those are the 4 issues with partisan politics.
Right.
All right. Anything, I want to make a quick, before we end, channel update. For those listening on a recording, we've started streaming these things live. We've been kind of beta testing them out for the last couple of weeks, and I think we're going to do that as well. Something that might be enticing for those is we at least try to do a pre-show, where for a small amount of time we engage with listeners, and after that we do the show live, and then after the show is complete, we do a post show where we kind of do the same thing. We address questions from those who were watching live, and try our best to clarify on anything, or even take suggestions for other episodes. So if that's something you think you might be interested in, I'm going to put a link anywhere that I can that this gets posted to. For those of you who maybe for some weird reason are hearing this in a way where that you don't get to see those, the link would be www.dlive.tv. That's DLIVE.tv /Fauxlosophers. FAUXLOSOPHER. Yeah.
Yes.
Done. Yeah. S. Yes, there's an S on the end of it. I don't want you to get lost. So we would really appreciate if you came out, or if you're interested in. Totally your choice. We're just glad you're listening. But if you want to hear us cover a specific topic or have some input, and we don't claim to have ideas or represent the mind of greatness. At
least not that often.
At least not that often. And we'd really appreciate it. So with that all being said, Fauxlosophers.